Hi, my name is Nathaniel Jones, and I'd like to thank you for joining this webinar, End-Use Load Profiles for the U.S. Building Stock, Residential Stock Model Calibration and Validation by Anthony Fontanini. This webinar is hosted by the IBIPSA USA Research Committee with the goal to share new ideas from research to the building simulation community. If you have questions during this webinar, please type them in the chat window. At the end of the 40-minute presentation, I will unmute our audience on Zoom for a discussion with Tony. Next slide, please. AIA Continuing Education Credit is available for attending this webinar. Please email info@aiaeb.org with your AIA membership number to receive credit for attending today's event. And now, I would like to introduce Anthony Fontanini. Go ahead.
Well, thanks everyone for joining us here today. Maybe before we get started, I give a little bit of background about myself while we let other folks kind of trickle in a little bit. I'm a senior research engineer in the residential research buildings research group at NREL. I've been here about 3 years. Since joining NREL, I've mainly been here to help improve the building energy stock models and in terms of their validation against various data sources, a largely part of what we're going to be talking about here today. I was a residential loads lead for NREL's LA 100 project, where we helped LADWP identify pathways to get to 100% renewable generation by 2050 and how much potential is in the residential and commercial building stocks. For this particular project, or the End-Use Load Profiles project, I may mention this as EULP throughout the presentation. I'm the calibration lead, so I help lead and direct some of the updates, especially to the residential model, such that we can help improve the validation from utility service territory kind of scale, so sub-county, up to states, multiple states, and national kind of scale metrics. Previously, I was at Front Office CSE, where I mainly worked on building envelope material, research, ADEX, and I come from a background of continuum mechanics and computer science. What you may have seen on the website is hopefully what some takeaways that I hope you take away from the presentation today. What I'd like you to take away is being able to state various data sets available to validate building stock energy models, and specifically time series data. To be able to name important residential end-use loads that contribute to peak and annual energy consumption. Understand stock level, time series quantities of interest, and why we've chosen these metrics for validation. And then finally, maybe identify some stock characteristics that significantly impact building time series loads. And so what I'm going to go over today is a brief introduction to the project. I'll then mention a couple selective residential calibration updates that we've made and feature development that we've made throughout the course of this project. I'll go over our validation strategy and the quantities of interest. We'll then take a look at how the models are doing and the validation comparisons and some of the things that we have there. And then finally, since we're wrapping this project up at the end of the fiscal year, I'm going to talk a bit about our publication plan and the data that will be available at the end of this project, at the end of September. So with that, let's dive in. So what is an end-use load profile? End-use load profiles, or EULPs, describe how and when energy is being used. So here we're talking about how, meaning the appliance or the system that is using the energy. You know, lighting, whether it's clothes washer, clothes dryers, refrigeration, heating, cooling, and how these individual loads over a time series or over a course of time, hence the when, contribute to not only the building total energy consumption, but also the entire stock level energy consumption. So why do we need end-use load profiles? Currently, there's no comprehensive national data set for end-use load profiles for time-sensitive valuation of energy efficiency. The example I'd like to give here is time of use rates. On peak, if you have a time of use rate, the price of electricity is going to be more on or during times of the peak demand compared to off. And so we need some tools that allow us to evaluate energy efficiency measures and how much energy they can save on peak versus off peak. End-use load profiles are also helpful for utility scale resource and distribution planning, also at the state and local levels for energy planning and regulation. And they're generally needed for widespread adoption of technologies for grid interactive efficient buildings. So what's the challenge here? Historically, end-use load profiles have been attained through submetering studies. Researchers essentially go into homes, they monitor individual circuits to obtain these like device-specific load profiles. Generally, tens of millions of dollars are needed to monitor hundreds of homes. And so due to this cost for the submetering studies, they're often regionally limited. They're based on a fairly small sample. They're not the entire building stock. And the current gold standard here is the LCAP study, which was done in 1990, so it's currently 30 years old. So since we can't really do submetering for every location in the country, there's an opportunity currently for these tools, ResStock and ComStock, NREL's building stock energy models, where we statistically represent energy use of the US building stock. Now, previously, ResStock and ComStock were mainly used to produce annual energy consumption and energy savings metrics. So there's been a large effort in this project to calibrate and update these models such that they have a more accurate time series description of the load. So what are these models? Well, I guess our approach here that we're taking is first to go and collect the most comprehensive data set or data sets, the best ground truth data that is currently available. We're pulling from both existing submetering studies, whole building interval meter data or advanced metering infrastructure, AMI data. We're purchasing data from companies that help us understand how systems are actually being used and to extract probability distributions to update the models. And so we're trying to collect as much data as possible. On the residential side, we're talking roughly 4 million meters for AMI data. And so what we're using all of this data for is using this, trying to get a comprehensive view at different geographic and temporal scales to update the models such that in the end, we can produce a foundational data set of validated end-use load profiles for the US building stock. So what are these models for ResStock and ComStock? So ResStock for the residential building stock, ComStock for the commercial building stock. We'll mostly be talking about ResStock here today. But generally, they're kind of composed of the three different components. We have a probabilistic view of the US building stock. So here in the residential sector, we've got like 100 or so parameters that describe the building stock. We have distributions for each of these parameters. It doesn't mean that we have 100 distributions that represent the US building stock.
Okay,
Is
please
it
bear
just-
with us. We're just waiting for Tony to get his audio working again.
Hello, can you hear me again?
Yes.
I apologize for that. My phone hung up on me.
All right, you're sharing.
Thank you. These stock models, thank you for your patience, everyone. So we have these probabilistic representations of the stock. They're actually composed of hundreds of thousands of individual distributions that represent correlations and between the different parameters. What we do then is we basically sample from this probabilistic space, and we have, through a model articulation process, automatically produce Energy Plus and OpenStudio models, DOE's flagship physics-based computer energy models, which allow us to run sub-hourly simulations and produce end-use results. The way we currently have it set up now, for a typical national scale run, we're running hundreds of thousands of building energy models, currently running them both on Eagle and Amazon Web Services, and we're using big data tools in AWS to help reduce the size of the data sets. It's important to note that although this is an NREL-led project, we've got a PI at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. We're getting a lot of support from Argonne and our industry partners, EPRI and NEAP. One thing that's also unique about this project is that we've been able to pull together a technical advisory group, which consists of 65 in-kind participation from governments, utilities, academia, that has helped guide this project in terms of what we're producing and how we're generally doing. It's also important to note that I'm not the only one doing the work. I may be the one speaking today, but there's a lot of people that have helped over the course of the project for the residential calibration. Just to give you kind of a brief timeline, we're currently in the third year of this 3-year project. The first year was mainly spent identifying use cases for this data set, identifying data gaps, and starting to collect data. That data collection process has continued on through year 2 and most of year 3. And in the start of year 2, we started calibrating our residential and commercial stock models, ResStock and ComStock. At this point in time, the calibration for this project in residential has more or less completed. And we will be, we've more or less transitioned into producing products and what's going to be published for this project in the end of September. So there's a bit of an introduction to the project. I'll then kind of move on to some of the features that we've developed, or relatively important features, and how we're kind of making changes to the residential model. Probably the first and one of the largest features that we've been able to pull in to ResStock during the course of this project is an increased geospatial granularity. Before this project, on the left, we had basically this 215 weather regions and this 10 geographic regions more or less based on REX. And this was more or less limiting because we weren't able to integrate more regionally local data sets, and also reporting out to Building America climate zones or ISO or RTO regions is a bit difficult. And so we basically increase the resolution of ResStock down to either the PUMA or the county level, depending on where you are. PUMAs or public use microdata areas are basically 200,000 people. They're super small in large cities. You can see Chicago, there's a lot of PUMAs, so they're much smaller than Cook County in Chicago, but then they might be larger than counties in more rural areas. The other thing we spent a lot of time developing is producing high resolution weather data for the rest of the country. So we started out with this 215 kind of weather regions. Now between both ResStock and ComStock, we use between 900 and 1100 individual weather regions. So we're talking roughly one weather station for every 3 counties. We found that by increasing this resolution, the amount of weather files we have, we're able to better track actual weather events heading across grid territories for annual meteorological year or AMY data. We're pulling all this data from NOAA's Integrated Surface Data database and automatically kind of producing AMY files for the country, currently with capabilities basically to run from 2012 to 2019. So now that we have this increased granularity for geographic specificity, we can actually utilize this capability to get better characteristics within those areas. And so before the project, in the residential side, we more or less defined our heating fuel saturations. So on top, we've got our electric saturation, and on the bottom, we have natural gas saturation. And so this was more or less in groups of states. So not generally overly specific. The example I like to use is looking at Georgia on the natural gas side. If you look at Atlanta, there's a high concentration of natural gas in the Atlanta region, in the greater Atlanta region, but not necessarily the rest of the state. They're more dependent on electric heating systems. And so we weren't able to, so we're basically overestimating the amount of electric systems in some areas while underestimating in others. One other example of an update is we used to use relatively smooth schedules. The only relative kind of stochasticity for an individual model was in hot water draws, which does at least kind of affect, the sinks, showers, dishwasher, clothes washer a bit, but there generally was fairly smooth loads. And so to get some more realistic event-driven spikier loads for these models, what we did is we switched our average schedule-based approach to a model based on the American Time Use Survey, or ATUS. Here, ATUS, for those of you that are not familiar, we're basically taking activities from an individual day that people have reported, assigning them to energy relevant activities, and then generating a Markov chain from there to get a fairly stochastic realization of how people behave in different states across the US. And so the important takeaway from this kind of graphic here is, before there was a whole bunch of, no, we don't have a lot of schedule stochasticity or heterogeneity, but now we've more or less implemented a lot of different stochasticity. And so to give you an example here, here's a single home in a week realization. So in orange was before, blue is now currently. We have, our occupant schedule was basically constant every day. Now we have a more, people kind of come and go from the dwelling unit, and we get a little bit more variation. The same thing kind of goes with cooking, where we used to have the same schedule every day, how people use their electric range. But now we have variability in terms of the number of events that we get in any given day and the length at which people are cooking, such that when we start combining all of these individual realizations into more, so this is 1,000 homes at 10-minute realizations, we get a much smoother pattern for occupancy. And it turns out it looks like we were probably overestimating people leaving during the middle of the day. And for things like cooking, we're actually able to reconstruct the average shape that we were using before. So I mentioned submetering studies. So we were able to pull together 4 of these. I'll say 5 if we include the American Time Use Survey. But we're basically pulling from different submetering studies in Massachusetts and the Pacific Northwest, in Florida, and in Texas. You'll notice here that once you get these homes are on the order of 100, couple hundred, Pekin Street we got maybe 1,000, but they're smaller sections of the building stock. But we at least get ground truth information on how people use different end uses. So here I pulled a couple of examples. We've got dishwasher, clothes dryer, and cooking range. What's interesting here is this concept of transferability, where although there's some variation for each one of the end uses, they generally have the same shape. And so there's not a huge variation geographically about how people use electricity in these individual appliances, at least in terms of their schedule. And so here, what we did is we took what A2 said, updated it based on the ResStock, which is the blue line here. We've actually fixed this kind of jaggedness that you see in these plots. But right now, at least our schedules are more or less aligning with what the submetering studies are saying and A2s. So now we've been making these changes. That's great, but we need to understand how well we're actually doing compared to real world data. So how are we doing this validation? Here are the calibration dimensions for residential. It's basically a combination of EIA data, both from EIA form 861, 861M, and REX, the submetering studies that I was talking about earlier. This thing called load research data, which is typically at the utilities service territory kind of scale, that's hourly. They're typically constructed of a subset of AMI meters that are then scaled to essentially the residential load. And then we have advanced metering infrastructure, or AMI. And what we've done is we've gone through 5 kind of separate calibration regions for residential and focus in on how we can improve the model respective to these different regions. And so here, these different regions actually compose of 8 different utility service territories. But overall, this is kind of the overall picture of the different validation tools that we have available to us today. Looking at how these different data sources vary with different geographic scales on the x-axis and the temporal scales on the y-axis. The data sources from EIA they have full coverage of the contiguous in the United States, but they tend to be a lot closer, right? So we're talking annual energy consumption numbers. At least with REX, you can kind of slice and dice by the housing characteristics that exist. So that's an added benefit to REX that's not on this chart. We have monthly and state data from EIA on the natural gas side. There's some county specificity here because for certain utilities, we do get monthly load from the specific utility, but not all of them. While the AMI LRD comparisons, they're hourly, sub-hourly, but they're mostly like at the utility service territory scale, county, sub-county type of resolution. And then the submetering studies up in the upper right. So with those data sources, you're right. So ResStock is going to produce a time series. We have some time series results from the load research data and AMI comparisons. How are we going to summarize how accurate we're doing? These are what we call the quantities of interest. Now, although we have produced RSME and CVRSME, we chose these particular metrics because they're more driven by our technical advisory group and are more common for, at least in our experience, how utilities quantify peak base to peak ratio, in general quantify the shape of the load for the building stock. And so here we're looking at different seasons, summer, winter, and shoulder. We're pulling out essentially that minimum value for each season. We're pulling out the maximum value or the peak value for the given season. And then we're also considering about the high load days, making sure that we do get the peak value for the high load days for summer and winter. Now, it also matters what time the peak happens, right? So if ResStock is predicting a noon peak while the utility peak is 7 p.m., that's not great either. And so we're also looking at differences in terms of minutes of how the peak timing is between the time series data, the ground truth, and ResStock as well. So where are we currently? And how did we end up? I'll kind of start from a more course level and then work our way down into the different time series results. So here, looking at EIA form 861, we have annual annual energy sales from each utility in the US. With those, we're able to compare directly to 1,700 of them, I think out of 1,900 or so. And we get a relatively good comparison, at least at this course level metric. We get our R-squared value is 0.99, slopes 0.99, small bias at 0.1. Even though, and then on the other side, we have natural gas. So this is pulled from the EIA natural gas data. It's actually reported monthly, but this is rolled up into the annual number. Natural gas is not a huge focus for this project. However, we have seen general improvements across the calibration period. So here we're maybe slightly underestimating the amount of natural gas, right? So our slope is 0.88, maybe about by 12% or so. Relatively decent R-squared, relatively small. So from the annual metrics, we have at least a couple data sources that give us monthly comparisons by state, both from EIA form 861 and the natural gas data. Here, I just happen to pull Illinois. And we have each of these for each state in the contiguous United States. In this case, you can see we're maybe slightly high for some of the winter months and maybe a little low for the state in the summer months. But the good thing about these plots, at least we have coverage, right? So for the load research data and the AMI, we don't have coverage everywhere in the country. And so sometimes this is the best estimate that we have. So looking geographically at the AMI calibration regions, the regions that we really tried to focus in on, we tried to cover a set of various climates and different regions of the US. So we started our effort out in ComEd. We moved to Fort Collins, Colorado, up to Seattle. We did a 3-utility service territory region in mixed humid, hot humid climate as our 4th region. And then in the cold climates, most of Vermont and Cherryland, a rural area in Michigan. So how do our loads compare? All right, so here the black line is either the AMI or the load research data. This is summer broken out by weekday and weekends. So the big load here that you're looking at is the big blue load is cooling. Other important loads you see are, especially in Seattle, is this orange section, which is water heating. You've got this blue section underneath it, which is refrigeration. This black section is plug loads, and yellow is lighting. Just to kind of name a few. This purple section here is actually pumps and fans that correspond to HVAC systems. So you can kind of group, the blue and the purple together, if you'd like. In general, I think we're doing a relatively okay job in terms of how we're doing in terms of accuracy. Some areas were low, some areas were high, but there's no kind of consistent bias that we're seeing. And a lot of that is because we're trying to balance differences between different data sets. So although this may say one thing, the state comparisons may say something else. And so then here's winter. So we've switched that big blue load from cooling to heating with the red electric heating. Once again, we're kind of low in a couple areas like Cherryland. We might be high in areas like Seattle and Tallahassee, but generally, not overly too bad. And then looking at the shoulder seasons, hopefully trying to reduce as much as possible the heating and cooling loads that are needed, such that we can get a better idea of the non-weather dependent loads and how they're doing in terms of accuracy. Same kind of situation, high in some, low in others, fairly accurate numbers. The other thing that we've pulled together, like I said, was a utility service territory load research data. So here's kind of a map of 16 utilities that we've been able to pull together data from 2018, most of which is Pennsylvania, Ohio, ERCOT's down there on the bottom. We'll talk about that here in a bit, and we've got coverage in most of California. Now, before I show you the plots here, our first comparison in this project was actually a load research data comparison in 2012. And so over the course of the project, you can kind of see, although they are different years between 2012 and 2018, we've made significant improvements in terms of the load shapes. And now we haven't even focused in on these load research data comparisons. And so that the updates that we were making were nationally relevant updates. And so even though we were focusing on certain areas, we were still improving the rest of the country, the load shapes of different country, the rest of the country. And so here's kind of where we ended up in terms of summer for the average load shapes for utility LRD comparisons. Here's the winter, high in some, low on others. We're maybe a little uncertain in the number of customers in these two regions, which is why some of the discrepancies there. Generally, the load shape looks relatively good. And here's the shoulder. So these qualitative kind of comparisons of how the end uses kind of stack together to produce the overall load for the service territory are good and all, but really we should be comparing quantitative metrics, right? And so this is where the quantities of interest come in. Over the course of this project on the residential side, we've been able to essentially run 60 runs of ResStocks, testing each feature developed in each of those 60 runs, and then tracking their accuracy as we kind of move forward in the calibration updates. And so this was annual energy consumption and its error relative to the individual data set as we move forward with each update. And then for each utility service territory of the 5 calibration regions, we also have kind of this dimension plot where we're looking at the base load for summer, the average peak for summer, and the top 10 peak days, and the peak for that particular day, and how it is also changing through each of the calibration runs. And then also the timing metrics over here on the right, and generally how we're doing, how we're tracking. So now we're wrapping up this project at the end of September. What data is going to be available and in what forms? So generally, because of the scale of the results, we'll be producing roughly 800,000 building energy models that maybe are on the order of like 10 terabytes or so. We're gonna produce 3 different versions of the data set for folks to use. The first is kind of a pre-aggregated form. I'll talk about each one of these in more detail in a second. We're also going to provide a web viewer that'll allow people to kind of slice and dice and download their own data in which they're interested in. And then we will also provide all the data plus all the OpenStudio models in case you want to hook up your own big data analytics or run the OpenStudio models themselves. So the pre-aggregate load profiles. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the big data and then produce aggregate total and end use load profiles for each state, for each ASHRAE and Building America climate zone, for each ISO and RTO region, for all the public use microdata areas, so all 2,300 of those, and all US county in the contiguous United States. All of these will be in CSV form for folks to be able to download via Excel. It will include, not only like the average per unit consumption, it'll give you the total number of units in that area, given area. It'll also provide you with some variation metrics like standard deviation and the range at which we're seeing the results. So hopefully it'll give you an opportunity to judge what how much variation there is, between each of the models. For the web interface, the pre-aggregates were good because they're the entire stocks, right? But maybe you're not interested in the entire stock. Maybe you're only interested in certain building types or a certain geography that we didn't specifically aggregate to. Maybe we're only interested in summer and not winter, or a couple of months, or specific end uses, cooling versus heating. And so the web viewer will allow you to kind of query the data that we've linked up to to the web interface and show you a kind of an exploratory analysis for what you want. And then once you have what you desire, you'll be able to download the CSV file. And then finally, like I said, we'll be publishing all of the 800,000 models. It'll be on the order of tens of terabytes or so. We'll provide at least some level of high-level instructions how to link up big data analytics via Amazon Web Services to the data so that you can query it yourself and produce your own aggregates yourself. The models will also be available for download for you to run, modify yourself. And what we're end up producing here is not only we're going to use an annual meteorological year of 2018, but we're also going to have a run for typical meteorological year or TMY through data. For the buildings, we're not going to provide each of the EPWs, but we will provide at least for each location, we will provide at least a couple of important weather parameters like dryball, relative humidity, some of the solar, wind speed, building character, and we'll also provide some building characteristics. So with that, I think we'll open up for questions. Thanks for paying attention. Sorry about the whole audio situation cutting out, but I appreciate everyone sticking with me.
All right, thanks, Tony. That was a really interesting presentation, and I'm sure that there are going to be a lot of questions for you. I want to give everyone a moment to type their questions into the chat windows, and I also want to remind everyone that if you are seeking continuing education credit from the AIA, please provide your membership number and email info@aiaeb.org. While people are typing their questions, I want to start with one of my own. It looks like you've relied a lot on taking some of the maps that were on a state level and breaking them down into counties and pumas, and then regrouping those into some different types of functional areas, like by weather or something else. What considerations go into deciding how to group counties and pumas into the regions that you showed in these maps?
It's more of a definition. So most of the Building America climate zones, the ISO RTO regions, Building America climate zones, ASHRAE climate zones are mostly defined at the county level. And so it's more of a one-to-one mapping between these counties and these other kind of geographic regions of interest. Pumas are a bit tricky. They're actually a collection of census tracts, and they don't generally align with counties at all. However, we are building out capabilities to even increase the granularity in case cities are interested in looking at more neighborhood-specific kind of granularity. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. I'm looking to see what question is next, and we've got a question coming in from Amanda. Amanda, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, hey Tony, thanks for the presentation. Just quick clarifying question. When you're doing your power and keeping up with the average daily megawatts and that sort of thing, how are you pulling that out of Energy Plus? Are you just using your hourly data to do that, or are you guys actually running it at a finer time scale?
We're running at 15-minute and then reporting at 15-minute at the time step. And we're just pulling it out through reporting measures in Studio. So we can pull out the total site, the net site. We've been including PV in our loads as well, and their saturation. And then pulling out all the individual enduses as well. So
can I ask a follow-up, or do you guys have a big backlog of questions? So can you talk a little bit about how did you find, since you've looked at all these different levels of aggregation, can you talk about, did you find that when you are looking at power in particular or hourly loads, that you need to go to a different level of aggregation, or that you're more or less accurate in certain regions, versus doing the more typical, like, let's calibrate based on annual EUI? Just curious if you could talk more about that.
Yeah, no. So we have a whole bunch of different data sources. Like you said, they span different geographic and temporal scales. And surprise, surprise, they don't always agree. Part of it, could be that, we might be doing okay at the state level. Maybe just because, we characterize the state maybe a little bit better. Or, I'm thinking of like Cherryland, we're a bit low in our load there, right? So maybe it's just a lower section of the load, whereas Michigan as a whole, I think we're actually overestimating the total energy consumption, right? And so it's like the natural variation within the state, is also hard to completely characterize because we don't have AMI data or load research data, in every county or every, utility service territory there. But yeah, oftentimes the data at different scales, they don't agree with each other. And, that's why we kind of have this like Rubik's Cube to try to figure out how to balance all the different data sources together.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks. We've got a question coming in from Mansawi, who wants to know, is there any plan to add EV load profiles? So I think that's looking at electric vehicles.
Yes, there is. This next fiscal year. We're still in negotiations here a bit in terms of scope with DOE, but we are planning on working with our transportation team at NREL to bring in what they've done to produce EV load shapes as part of this project.
All right. And we've got a question coming in from Zoltan. Zoltan, you want to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question?
Sure, thank you. Thanks, Tony, for the very nice presentation and a lot of work doing all the data sources. I have a question because I'm interested in generating individual load profiles for individual homes when you aggregate them into like neighborhood, sort of like microgrid. Is that possible to extract from your data without having the same load profile for every building to create some sort of random variation into it that still makes sense?
Yeah, so you won't be able to pull obviously neighborhood scale, right? So we're talking, PUMA, we're talking collection of census tracts in cities. This is going to be the finest that you're going to be able to pull, but we will at least have a subset of models there. There might be, anywhere from, a dozen to a handful to, I don't know, a couple hundred maybe, right? And so each one of these through the stochastic event load generator is going to have real, like, kind of spiky occupancy and use loads, at least for the base loads themselves. And then they'll obviously have, heating, their own heating and cooling profiles. And so, yeah, you could download the data or the models and you would still get variations with those as well.
That's awesome. Cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. And we've got a question coming from Gian.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you for the great presentation, great work. I have a couple of things I want to ask. One is, I can see that you describe the building characteristic. You collect enough data to develop the distribution of that. One is, where can you have confidence about finding such a distribution, especially you're talking about different geographic area, and the nation is very different. And then once you have this, how can you combine them using a statistic way so the models have a representation of that? That's my number one question. Number two is, what about the future? Let's say 5 years later, 10 years later, we start to do electrification, other things. The stock is going to change. How are you going to keep up with the stock change and then update the model?
Yeah, so maybe I'll take the second one first. So right now the models, at least for ResStock, is mostly anchored in 2018, between 2016 and 2018, simply by the data sources that we have. There are plans to, as especially Rex 2019, 2020 comes out, they did a lot of web surveys. They'll have like state, so there'll be a lot more samples we're expecting here. And so there are plans to continue to update the characteristics as the stock continues to change over time. And so, I saw a question in the chat too about the pandemic and effects that may have. I expect that when the data becomes available, we will have a chance to update the models, but currently we don't have any plans for that as well. Maybe going back to your first question. So on the residential side, we are mainly anchored in national surveys, like REX from the US Census, the American Community Survey, the American Housing Survey, the PUMS, the Public Use Microdata Sample, where there are specific geographies in which they do provide samples for. And so we develop distributions based on the number of samples that are in any given geography that is available, right? So like for the American Housing Survey, I think they provide the top 13 largest metropolitan statistical areas, and then Census Division estimates then after that. And so if we are based on that, for the American Housing Survey, I think we are for like clothes washer and clothes dryer presence, or saturation of clothes washer and clothes dryers. We have that type of resolution. So in large cities, we would have a higher resolution than the rest of the Census Division. Does that help at all? Did you need to follow that up?
Just last piece of that was when you have such a thing, you believe you have this thing, how you combine them to building that covers the variation of such parameters.
Yeah, so we'll basically look at, there'll be a set of samples from the distribution. They'll be weighted accordingly. So we'll construct the distribution based on the weighted samples accordingly.
Thank you.
All right, and please, if you have any other questions, type them into the chat. We're happy to answer more questions. We've got one coming in now from Nigel. Nigel, do you want to turn on your microphone and ask your question?
Right. Good morning from New Zealand. It's rather early here, and the sun's coming up, which explains my awful shadows.
Thanks for joining.
That is an amazing project and incredibly exciting, and acknowledging the amazing data that you've built it on. I did a similar project for this country based on 400 houses, so let's not pretend it's comparable. But one thing that we've found was quite a significant amount of non-utility energy. And so in our case, it was concerned with people burning timber for heat, and there's a lot of that. How are you dealing, not so much with timber, but non-utility sources like PV? Because one would expect the sorts of houses that moved into, for example, PV would have much more efficiency, much lower demand in certain areas.
Yeah, so maybe different heating fuels. So right now we do actually allocate some samples to wood burning energy here. There's not a whole lot of units, at least fractionally. They probably add up to a sizable amount, nationwide. We don't actually model their energy. I realize that might be important for carbon, and I think there are plans to do that moving forward. And so currently we just tag the samples so that we know how many dwelling units they are, and then we have characteristics, of these samples as well, of these homes and what they kind of look like. So that's kind of how we handle it now. Not overly elegant. But right now we're mainly focused on electric and gas.
All right.
Your second question, PV, right?
Yeah.
So for PV, we actually have a few data sources. We've been working with the folks at NREL that curate the DGen model, and they've been working with the University of Texas. And we have a couple data sources that tell us where the installations are in the US, how big the systems are. And so we're able to kind of combine a couple of those data sources into essentially saturation, how many PV systems are in relative to the number of dwelling units. We're doing only single family. And we kind of have distributions of how big the systems are for any given state. So that's at least what we've been able to allow.
the part of the logic behind my question is I noticed California was sort of well off the line there. I don't know how many PVs are there, but my sort of gut feeling was California would be quite large in that area.
Yeah, so California is, if you look at the EIA data, is by far the largest difference between the reported load and the like total generation. So we add a piece for small scale solar for the residential section, and California is by far the largest like offset. If you were seeing it was off, I knew it was off in the natural gas area, so I think we're a bit low on natural gas when it comes to California. But we are correcting at least the monthly state values according to the PD. And then on the hourly data, so we have load research data for Southern California Edison and LADWP, PG&E. We can at least offset it by a state average. That's about as close as we got. So,
thank you.
Yeah.
All right. We have, on the topic of PV, we've got a similar question coming from Alamelu. Alamelu, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Sure. I think Anthony pretty much answered my question. Just I want to know whether the current model set excluded the PV generated parcels, or there are some samples we can use it.
In the raw data sets or in the models that we're producing?
The calibrated model set.
They will be. So there will be some models with PV in them. The good news is we'll be reporting both the total site electricity, so all of the electricity being used, and then break that up by end use. But then we'll also provide the net site electricity, which is the subtraction of the PV from that. And so if you want to include the PV, you can include it. If you want to strip it out, you can also include that as well.
You mentioned that 450,000 models for the residential side. Do you know how many of them are going to be for PV?
Oh man, it's going to vary by state.
Okay.
So California will have a lot more. I think some of the other ones that have higher saturations, I think New England, Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, I think have higher saturations. Texas has a lot of units with PV, but not necessarily relevant relative to the entire state. But there'll be a ton of samples in Texas probably, and so you'll get some in there as well.
Thank you so much.
We're glad to have a lively discussion here on these topics, and I want to remind you that if you have your own questions, please type them into the chat window and we'll get around to you. It looks like we've got a question coming from Jim. Jim, do you have a microphone you can ask your question with?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, my question is, given the data gaps that you have observed, do you have suggestions about what the most useful information would be to close the remaining differences?
Oh man, unfortunately, that's not my area. So I can send you a couple contact information. So Eric Wilson is PI of the project.
Yeah.
Also Elena Present, she was heading up the whole data gathering kind of effort. We do have the end of the first year, we published a report on use cases and data gaps. Actually, so maybe I should reference you to that as well.
Okay, nice work, thanks.
Yep.
All right. Well, I just want to remind everyone one more time, if you want to get into the last question here, please type it in the chat window. It's been a great discussion with you, Anthony. I'd like to know, what are the big things that you'd like people to get out of what you're doing? I know that there's a lot here that's geared at utilities, but what can people with who are thinking about their own houses, their own energy efficiency do with this data?
Yeah. So I mean, by far, I think the products of this this project, I think, has been highly driven by who's on our technical advisory group over the past couple of years, which has been a lot of utility kind of driven kind of scale analyses. The good news, if you want to look at your own home, right, and this has been kind of the motivation for developing ResStock. The models may not be perfect, and maybe you may not be an expert on calibrating your own building energy model. And so what we provide is a set of homes that can be relatively similar. So you can kind of down select down to maybe where, the geography that you live, the year that your home was built, or at least a decade, the type of home, square footage, range, and then you'll get a distribution of values. And then if you are able to run, the models and applying different energy efficiency measures to them will give you a range of estimates in terms of savings rather than just a single number.
Okay, thank you. Well, we're coming up on the end of our hour right now. I want to thank you, Tony, for this presentation. Thanks to everyone who joined us at this IBIPSA USA Research Committee webinar. If you enjoyed this webinar, please consider joining the IBIPSA USA Research Committee. Email research@ibipsa.us. That's research at ibpsa.us, or visit the link in the Zoom chat for more information. I'll paste that link into the Zoom chat shortly. For those of you who are joining us on YouTube, we hope that you enjoyed today's event. Please share this event and please like it and subscribe to our channel for more webinars like this. And then we're inviting you all next month to join us again on August 26th at noon Pacific time, when Parastu Delgoshi presents a knowledge representation and reasoning framework for building applications. Thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoy this meeting and have a good week.